Good morning and welcome to the Hydro-JULES 2020 webinar. We're really happy to have you all with us, and as you can see, the programme for the next hour is in front of you on the screen. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Simon Dadson, who's going to introduce Hydro-JULES next generation land surface and hydrological predictions.
Great, thanks very much, Victoria. And it's a pleasure to have so many people on the call. I'm going to show some slides to give an update on how things are going with the Hydro-JULES program. So Hydro-JULES is now in its second year, tagline Next Generation Land Surface and Hydrological Predictions. And it is given the aim to produce a fully integrated open source coupled model of the terrestrial water cycle, which will stand alone and be able to be used to solve hydrological problems, but which crucially is also going to be linked to the JULES Joint UK Land Environment Simulator. It's a 5-year program led by UKCEH with BGS, British Geological Survey, and NCAS, the National Centre for Atmospheric Sciences, and runs from 2018 to 2023. There are a number of motivating questions for wanting to engage in this model development project, and I've listed some on the screen there and on the next slide. It's to look at questions like how do hydrological systems respond to current and future climate variability, particularly in light of non-stationarity, non-stationary climate, non-stationary land cover and human drivers. To look at how we might better make use of high intensity, high resolution products, estimates, observations, model predictions of things like convective precipitation, lots and lots of new observed products and model simulations in that field coming out at present. To think about how we can develop models that are able to respond dynamically to changes in land use and land management that resolve those processes and the physics, biology, chemistry that lies behind them explicitly to inform policy decisions in that area. And then on this slide, a number of other questions looking at the interaction with changing biogeochemistry and nutrient cycles. At the local scale, looking just at the UK, that might involve looking at pollution and the transmission of pollutants through our watercourses. But obviously, this is an important issue at the global scale as well, looking at biogeochemical cycling in the oceans, transmission of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other macronutrients to the ocean basins. And then a couple of interesting themes in relation to data assimilation, which we're going to hear more about later on in the webinar, and also estimation of uncertainty and sensitivity in the hydrological process chain. So these are the motivating questions which have led NERC to fund a project which is building the infrastructure to address them. Of course, it's a national capability program, and so the intention is that the wider research and academic community in the UK and overseas should be enabled to answer these questions better using the infrastructure that's developed as a result of funding Hydro-JULES. And in that vein, we've had a number of community consultations on the areas where science priorities should lie. And the icons on the screen there are just articulating the outcome of those consultations. Big focus wished for by the community in improving large area estimates of groundwater recharge, groundwater properties and so on. And Andrew Hughes and colleagues from BGS are going to talk a lot about that later on. Thinking about soil hydraulics, representing soil hydraulics in more physically reasonable ways. Getting better estimates of canopy interception and evaporation, which are useful when looking at changes in land cover. Inundation from all sources, so combining models of fluvial, coastal, pluvial, and other forms of flood inundation. And then crucially looking at anthropogenic influences on the water cycle. We know that in many areas, particularly in the UK, but also overseas, the anthropogenic overprint is now more than just a small component of the water cycle. In many cases, it's equivalent in order of magnitude to the natural fluxes. And then 3 components at the bottom expressed by the community: a desire for quantification of uncertainties, a very strong desire for interoperable components, and a framework which allows different representations of processes to be considered, which Thibaut's going to talk a bit about later on. And then, as I said before, data assimilation as well. I'm just going to run through some of the examples of work that have been done in Hydro-JULES to date in each of those areas. This is an example which brings together a range of different estimates of soil moisture across the country. Cosmos field scale instrumentation, the JULES model, of course, and then 3 state-of-the-art Earth observation instruments used to detect signals related to soil moisture from space. And we've had some pretty clear success using all of those sources of information to better constrain the simulations that we do using the JULES land surface model. And this is thanks to work by Elizabeth Cooper, Ewan Pinnington, Jan Peng, and many others behind the scenes as well. You can see on the left-hand slide there that the posterior distribution of JULES soil moisture estimates at this particular location is significantly closer to the observations that we get from the Cosmos Field Scale Centre as a result of this data assimilation activity, and is likely in the next year or so to result in a 1 kilometre resolution soil moisture product for the UK coming out of this programme. Another example is looking at fluvial flood inundation. We have 2 scales of application. One is at 1/2 degree global, really for looking at the role that the water cycle plays in the carbon cycle and in the Earth system. And you can see a diagram there from Toby Matthews and Dai Yamazaki working together to estimate flood inundation in the Amazon, which is hugely important when looking at methane emissions and closing the carbon budget globally. And also at the other end of the spectrum, the finer resolution national scale model, here looking at 1 kilometre over the UK. What's shown there is a prototype over England, which is looking at national scale estimates of fluvial flood inundation at 1 kilometre, which again will be linked to all of the component models in JULES, and therefore bridge that gap between atmospheric predictions, terrestrial hydrological predictions, and discharge into ocean basins. I won't say too much about groundwater because my colleague Andrew Hughes is going to talk more about that later on, but a huge effort from BGS to map aquifer properties and produce a fine resolution national scale set of estimates of aquifer properties, specific yield, hydraulic conductivity, and many other things, which will underpin national scale groundwater modelling, again in conjunction with our other representations of the terrestrial hydrology. And a word about how people might engage with this piece of science, this piece of modelling infrastructure. We've got 3 tiers which are being developed. One is intended for beginner users who can log in via a web interface. I think there's a picture of the web interface. There isn't a picture of the web interface. So log in via a web interface and do analyses of their own using pre-calculated data sets and model results. This will appeal to anybody really who's able to use a Python script through a Jupyter notebook. So somebody who is in the later years of school or early years of their university education, and also some of our practitioner and regulatory end users as well who've expressed a desire for this functionality. The second tier, which involves collaboration using the Jasmine data-intensive supercomputer, which is shown on the right-hand side of the slide here, and collaboration is now possible using the Jasmine Group Workspace system to run the suite of models that we are working with. And then a third tier for those who wish to develop and contribute code, which is managed and orchestrated through the same repository that the JULES code base is using as well. So 3 different levels of access depending on your level of familiarity with this type of modelling and the degree to which you wish to invest time in looking at these things. All really gearing towards an aim of making hydrological predictions which are seamless between global modelling, regional downscaled projections, and the impacts which they then create. Many of the people who are going to speak after me will talk in much more detail about those different components, and so I won't dwell on them now. But what I do want to say is that part of the ethos of national capability funding is that this is about engagement and sustainability of the project goals through the fostering of partnerships between research and academic community, and other stakeholders. We are very, very happy to be contacted by people who are interested in collaborating or in using the outputs of the program. A number of concrete ways in which that can happen. We have a summer student program, which is currently sadly on hold due to COVID situation, but which will reopen for applications in March 2021. Visiting scientist program. This is for post-PhD scientists who have their salary funded elsewhere but need to cover travel and subsistence to collaborate, come on sabbatical visits and come on cooperative research visits to any of our partner institutions. And then, of course, this webinar is replacing our in-person science conference, which we held last year about this time very successfully, and we're planning another similar in-person event for 2021. So I think my time is up and I'll leave it there, but very happy to take any questions if anybody has any questions to offer at this point.
One question's come through, Simon. I can see that England and Wales is included in your modelled outputs. What is the situation for Scotland?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Scotland is modelled, but at present that particular diagram was taken from an evaluation study for which we only currently have flood inundation data for England. And so the simulation itself and all of the supporting data sets to do the simulation exist and have been used over the whole of the British mainland. But sadly, because we only have flood inundation validation data for England from the Environment Agency at present, we obviously we can't show the comparison between observed and modelled for that region. But yes, Scotland is definitely included in the scope of our modelling effort. And if anybody on the call would like to discuss that further, I'd be very happy to do so.
Okay, thank you. We'll pass on to Eleanor now.
Lovely. Okay, so 10 minutes, guys, to talk about my absolute favourite subject, and I will try and keep down to 10 minutes. So evaporation and potential evaporation, they're often words that are used in hydrological and land surface science meetings. So I'm just going to have a really brief overview of what I think is going on and see if I can unravel some of it. No, why isn't that? There we go. Okay, first slide. So in this slide, you can see two very different scenes, a very wet, rainy, cold scene and a hot, dry scene. This kind of exemplifies, I guess, the difference between potential evaporation and actual evaporation, because in these two scenes, the potential evaporation will be completely different. The potential evaporation is how, if it was all wet, how much would it be evaporating? So it represents how hot and dry and sunny the conditions are. Whereas the actual evaporation is, in practice, how much evaporation is occurring. So the interesting thing about these, I haven't done a calculation, but the interesting thing about these two scenes is that they might actually have the same actual evaporation, but very different potential evaporation. I'm just going to kind of go through some of the sort of physics and so on that go into making these calculations. So we'll stick with potential evaporation for the moment. Potential evaporation is what I call the evaporative demand of evaporation. How much evaporation would you get if it was wet? So I think you can probably hopefully see my little arrow here. The schematic I've put here on the top is showing kind of how we calculate these things. So we have an air temperature and humidity, which lead to a humidity deficit hanging up here with the blue line. And then we've got some kind of turbulent transfer between that and the surface. So the surface has its own temperature and humidity. And oh, I've lost my little arrow. Never mind. That squiggly thing is the turbulent transfer between, which we call the aerodynamic resistance. If the surface was completely wet, then we would know what the surface humidity was, because it would be the saturated humidity at the surface temperature. But actually, it's not always wet. There are plants and there's soils and so on. The water is within those surface bodies. So we have a thing called the surface resistance, which is representing the gradient of humidity between the absolute surface and where the water is within the surface. Now, when we talk about potential evaporation, we are assuming that there's very little resistance to the evaporation, that the water can flow fairly easily from the land to the atmosphere. But there are two competing theories about this. One is that it's all driven by the energy. And that is the Priestley-Taylor, the PT estimate of potential evaporation. And the equation there is showing that the A is the amount of energy, the amount of sunshine there is saying that that potential evaporation is some function of temperature, which is the del, and this amount of energy. But the Penman-Monteith equation is saying, well, no, the air dryness itself is also changing the evaporation. And so that's the Penman-Monteith estimate of the potential evaporation. And the two figures on the right, the upper one is the Penman-Monteith one, which is including the drying effect of the dry air, whereas the one below is saying, no, it's all about the energy. So you can see they're quite different, particularly over hot, dry areas like the Sahara, and using one or the other is going to substantially change your estimates of evaporation. These two diagrams on the right, by the way, are from the Whedon et al. Paper looking at global meteorological data. And in our estimates, we then apply a surface resistance, a standard surface resistance of 70 seconds per metre, which is the RS for a well-watered grass. So is that done and dusted? We now know what the evaporation is because we know what the evaporation, we can apply this calculation. But to get the actual evaporation, we need to accommodate how dry things can get. And the surface resistance can depend on all sorts of things. It can depend on the light levels. It can depend on the carbon dioxide in the air, the temperature and humidity of the air. So there's actually a feedback between the humidity deficit and the stomata in the leaves and so on. Obviously, the soil moisture, that's accounted for in most models. And then there's the interception of water on the leaves. There's chemical interactions with the leaves. So for instance, ozone can damage the stomata, which changes the evaporation. And there's nutrients in the soil. And in some ways you could say that all of land surface science is all about calculating surface resistance. And we have a model, JULES, which spends quite a lot of effort calculating all sorts of things about the land and the soil. And in some ways, it all comes down to the surface resistance. So I just want to sort of explain why we're so obsessed with it. Why do we need to know this evaporation so carefully? In the JULES model is used in many applications. There's a little schematic showing some of its applications. It's used in earth system modelling, it's used in hazard forecasts, it's used in water resource assessments. And it's because this evaporation drives the climate and the weather and has an impact on hazards. So it's a very important part of the land surface. Some examples are that, for instance, if things are drying out a lot, that there's a major impact on the surface temperature. So the atmospheric community are very interested in evaporation because for them it drives not only the water coming into the atmosphere, but it also effectively drives things like heat waves. They have there's a strong control of the land on the atmosphere through the surface, and it's all about this evaporation. The evaporation will cool it, so there's no evaporation, it gets hot. And the heat wave, for instance, in 2003, this is an image of the surface temperature. And some of that surface temperature increase in southern France is to do with the air temperature, but some of it is about the dryness of the soils. And there's a paper that Paul de Meyer has just written looking at this in the summer 2018, and whether that summer, whether the heat wave during that time was exacerbated by the dry soils and therefore through the evaporation impact on the energy budget. It's also important on short timescales. This is a really nice paper that's just come out by Connie Klein and Chris Taylor. And this is showing that at short timescales, patches of dry air can affect the energy of the atmosphere to the extent that it starts to intensify mesoscale storms in West Africa. So I haven't got time to go through these diagrams, but the top right one is really the clue that the dry areas coincide with very intense storms. So the evaporation and its impact on the energy budget is having a big impact. But it's not just the atmosphere that's interested in evaporation. It can affect water resources as well. This is an example I've just pulled out of some of our work at the global scale. So those little images on the left are the annual runoff from the Yellow River in China, from a whole range of land atmosphere models. And you can see that if you take the next picture on the right, where they're all joining up, that's the total evapotranspiration. They're all kind of agreeing what the seasonal evaporation is. It goes up and has a maximum in July and goes back down again in the winter. But if you look at the top right, you'll see the impact on runoff is that there's a really big range of runoff. And that's because their evaporation, even though they're similar, it's a dominant part of the water budget in this river catchment. And so small errors in evaporation can have a big impact on the runoff, and that has a huge implications for water resources in the region. So what about the UK though? Most of the time in the UK, we are running at potential that all through the winter and so on. We have a fairly wet country, as you know. So although evaporation is an important part of the budget, we are well be able to understand it with potential evaporation. But we've got some evaporation measurements across the UK. Down on the map on the left is showing you all our flux tower positions. And the time series there on the right is the readout for the actual evaporation during the summer of 2018 at Sheepdrove, which is in the Cotswolds. It's actually the Downs, isn't it? It's the Lambourne Downs, sorry. So the light green image line is the potential evaporation. You can see it increases up over the summer, but the dark green is the actual evaporation. So as it dries out, the actual evaporation is much, much lower than the potential evaporation. This is the sort of thing we need to know to be able to capture, as I say, both the meteorology and the hydrology. So my final science slide is this, that we've done calculations of evaporation across the whole of the UK. Now, this might be a little bit subtle here because this is an annual average. So the annual average evaporation isn't far off the potential. On the left, we've got the actual evaporation over a year. The middle one is the potential evaporation. The one on the right is actually potential evaporation that includes interception, which is a slightly lighter colour yellow, you can see. So that means it's slightly higher evaporation if you include how much water has actually been intercepted and evaporated in that way. And so comparing the actual evaporation with PE, the things that really jump out are the urban areas, the evaporation is much lower. So that's of interest to the meteorological community because that's where storms might be triggered. We've got a high energy input into the atmosphere in those regions, but low water input. That's an important, and those gradients of temperature will be important for the meteorology. It's interesting to the hydrologists because that means the urban areas are generating a lot of runoff. So low evaporation means high runoff. You'll see that in the West Country, down in Cornwall and the west of Wales, the actual evaporation is higher than the potential, because there's quite a lot of interception in those areas. So we have a strong west to east rainfall gradient in the UK. So the figure on the right is capturing the potential evaporation. This figure would be different if we were able to show you. I just didn't have time to get it, but the summer you would get a much bigger difference between the actual evaporation and potential evaporation. So that's my final slide. Thank you very much for listening. I think evaporation is a very important part of the water cycle, and we have new observations from satellite, from flux towers, and so we can witness the impact on both the land surface and the atmosphere, and have found it to be very important. Thank you very much. Oh, and if you have any questions, don't ask me now. We've got a question session after Andrew Hughes's talk. Thank you.
So I'm Andrew Hughes. I work for the British Geological Survey, and I have the privilege of leading the subsurface element of Hydro-JULES, something that I really enjoy. And what I want to talk to you today about is putting groundwater into large-scale hydrological modelling, challenges and progress to date. And I haven't got time to name check all the team, but in particular, I want to thank for the slides Johanna Scheidegger, Sarah Collins, and Alberto Martinez de la Torre at UKCEH. So in terms of what I want to talk about, I think the important thing, and in the title is the word challenges. And so one of the important things as any science is the classic heterogeneity, uncertainty, and scale. And these apply up front and centre in terms of simulating groundwater systems, which is what we're all about. And really, we're working at a couple of scales within Hydro-JULES. So we're working at the British mainland scale, including Scotland, Wales and England, and also global as well. And I think these on the screen at the moment are two surface geology diagrams, really illustrating how heterogeneous the subsurface can be. And these are just surface geology. And we'll come on to the distinction between 2D and 3D later on in the talk. Now, so what I want to do first is look at, show you some of the progress we're making with the British mainland scale model, and then I'll go on to briefly summarise where we are with the global scale groundwater modelling. So just to start off with, given the heterogeneity we're dealing with, given the high level of uncertainty that's going to occur in the subsurface we generally measure at a few points. Yes, we might have 1 million boreholes onshore in the UK, but we still have quite a high level of uncertainty in large parts of the subsurface within the British mainland. So one of the ways we deal with that, particularly in the groundwater science, is to make sure we have very, very well-defined questions. That helps focus what the modelling is built for. So in terms of Hydro-JULES, we've chanced upon at the moment two main questions, and they relate to extremes. So the first one is, how can an integrated approach, including groundwater within the terrestrial hydrology, as Simon introduced very eruditely earlier, how can that integrated approach improve the simulation of major flooding events such as the 2013-14 floods, where we think groundwater played a large part either in vanilla groundwater flooding or in exacerbating surface flooding. And then at the other end of the extreme is, how can a holistic approach be undertaken to assess water resources under drought conditions? So in other words, does the bottom drop out of the wells, and do we not able to abstract groundwater, a very important part of the water resource story, particularly in the south and east of England. And the question is, why are we so interested in the British mainland scale? Well, I think this, in terms of these two questions, they very much operate at a larger scale than typically groundwater scientists work at, which is in the region of sort of tens of kilometres. And in the top left-hand diagram here, you can see flooding in the southeast, and if you look carefully, you can see that over a large part of the south and east of England, the floods in 13 and 14, which are very tragic to cause a lot of damage and other impacts in terms of livelihoods, but they actually was a significant part of groundwater was recognised, a significant role was groundwater was recognised in that. So we have a sort of large area that groundwater may play a part in. And the other thing is droughts, and as Eleanor quite eloquently said in the last talk, that there's a very significant west-east gradient in terms of rainfall, but also droughts can be heterogeneous as well. So here you've got the 2016, where you've got above average rainfall in Scotland, but very much below average rainfall in Wales and England. So in order to understand the impact of droughts on groundwater resources, we need to build a model that covers this whole domain. So how are we going to do that? Well, I think the important thing is for us, certainly in the UK anyway, where we're in new territory here. So what we want to do is develop a workflow that can be repeatable, can be open and transparent, and be handed over to other workers who want to take it on and do more with it. And this slide really illustrates at a very high level the workflow we're operating at. So we're going from a question through to a geological understanding, a conceptual understanding of groundwater flow, through to an understanding of where we don't want to model. So this diagram illustrates the fact that there's a base to where the active groundwater system in the British mainland. We then want to convert that into parameterization. So in other words, what are the hydraulic parameters of each bit of rock mass we want to look at? And then finally, we want to put that into a groundwater model to come out with results that can be used to answer the questions and then square the circle. So where are we in the moment of the process? Well, in terms of the British mainland, we have a geological model, and Simon kindly introduced that. And this is a basis for conceptualization, parameterization, and the actual geometry of the groundwater flow model, which I'll come on to in a bit. And this is the top right, illustrating the top right of this slide. We're currently conceptualizing groundwater flow. We've identified 14 key units, and we're undergoing detailed work on how to characterize them. What is the distribution of parameters within those units? And we've, in terms of parameterization, we've made a start on the chalk, which is the main aquifer in the UK, and that's ongoing, and we're investigating how to transfer that approach to other aquifer units, such as the Perma-Triassic aquifer and so on. And then we're also looking at the unsaturated zone, because water doesn't just leave the soil zone and miraculously arrive at the water table. We need to actually understand how to simulate that, and that's very complex. And we're undertaking a meta-modeling approach for that. I'm not going to provide much more details in this talk, but that's for a later date perhaps. And in terms of groundwater flow modeling, that's ongoing. And in the bottom right-hand corner, these are the first cut of results from our, if you like, version 0.1 of a groundwater model of the British mainland. So just in terms of the complexity and how we're dealing with that, again, this is a sort of variation of the geological map we saw earlier. These are the 14 units we're going to consider. And for each of these 14 units, we want to be able to create conceptual models. And colleagues, Brijo Doherty, Gareth Farr and Millie Lewis have been using their knowledge of Scotland, Wales and England to actually come up with conceptual understanding of how groundwater flows within these major chunks of the system. And then what we want to do is to take the geological model developed by Andy Newell, and then we want to create a 3D understanding of the aquifer system in the British mainland. And it's very important to have a 3D understanding, because when you abstract water, you don't abstract at the surface, you actually abstract aquifers that can be quite deep and actually be covered by non-aquifers or very low permeability deposits. And we need to understand the relationship between these aquifers and the surface if we're to then join up with our colleagues in the surface water field to provide a meaningful understanding of how the system works. But you can see from these cross sections here that in some parts of the country we don't have that complexity in terms of our chosen aquifer units. There are other sources of heterogeneity, but as you go particularly down to the south of England, you can see that the system gets much more complicated, and we're going to have to find a way of encapsulating that complexity into a groundwater model. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to try, we've got a current ongoing trial. Unfortunately, with the 10 minutes, I don't have good time to go into any details. We're choosing the Marlborough and Berkshire Downs to provide as a test case. We're also working in the East Midlands as well to actually test the workflow from the geological model all the way through to the groundwater flow model, which is incidentally is being developed in ModFlow 6, which is an open source groundwater code. And you can see here that what we do is break up the subsurface into a series of layers. We then interrogate the geological model, and we provide the parameterization to then go into the groundwater model. And that's ongoing at the moment. So in terms of the next steps of the British mainland work, what we want to do is actually then calibrate the model. As I said before, we've already got a working model. We want to improve that with the 3D understanding derived from the geological model. So we want to compare that output with groundwater heads. We want to compare simulated river flows, and on the right, top right here, you can see the river basins we're going to use to do that. And we're going to see how the model compares to different river catchments and geological units, and then use that to look at how does the model perform in these extreme situations, which is helping answer the questions we posed earlier. And then, of course, we want to integrate this into the Hydro-JULES framework, and Thibaut is going to talk about that in a minute. So we need to work on integrating ModFlow 6 into this framework, and we will then use this model to help us understand and answer these questions in a true integrated fashion. So that's where we are with the British mainland model. What I want to briefly talk about is where we're interested in the global modelling, and Eleanor put up some really interesting diagrams in the previous talk, and clearly we have to address groundwater modelling at a global scale in order to, again, provide that square the circle in terms of the hydrological cycle. So we sit, it's a very sort of humble position we sit in the subsurface. Our physics that we deal with is very simple compared to land surface models. It's mostly a lot simpler, but there are challenges, and those challenges relate to complexity, the lack of data, and the resulting uncertainty. Yes, we may have 1 million boreholes in the UK, and there are significant numbers more around the world, but they're not accessible in terms of data terms. They haven't been characterized in a true 3D understanding. So we don't really understand the 3D nature of the subsurface on a global basis. It's very important to, because aquifers are not laterally connected necessarily, and they're not even connected locally to the surface as well. So how do you actually determine the input of the aquifers to the river system? As I said before, we've got an issue of data availability. Is either a low density of boreholes, they're physically not drilled, or actually they may not be recorded and made available in an open way. And again, we've got uncertainty with respect to parameterization, and that's driven by this lack of understanding, lack of confidence in the geological structure and rock mass properties. We do have some advantage. Colleagues within BDS have been working on Africa for a number of years with colleagues in the African hydrogeological community. So we have a very good conceptual understanding of Africa. And as the diagram I showed earlier, there's this a very interesting global initiative called One Geology, which brings together 1 million scale geological maps for the whole of the globe. And that's a very useful resource, very helpful initially. So the first step we've got to do is actually put a groundwater model that we know and trust into a land surface model. As Eleanor again introduced, we're going to use JULES. In this case, at the moment, we're not really going to use the Hydro-JULES framework. We have actually put a groundwater model into JULES itself. This is not without its challenges, because what we've got to do is interact properly with the soil layer. And we've had a little bit of struggle with this. Initially, we used leaf hydro as a basis, but when we started to run this model in test cases, we found some issues, and actually we've changed to use a variety of techniques, and from the literature, new et al, and also work done by colleagues in Bristol University, reported by Batelis as part of his PhD. And this has been incredibly useful. An example of, Simon says, the outreach we're undertaking in terms of Hydro-JULES and linking up with other institutions around the UK. So basically, if the water table is below the soil layer, then recharge is calculated on the basis of this equation. If it's above, then obviously there's no recharge to the water table, but then there is interaction and making sure that the correct soil layer saturates at the correct time. We are drawing on the leaf hydro approach, which is using lateral connections based on the hexagonal grid, octagonal grid, I beg your pardon, and making sure that there's 8 nearest neighbours. We've also got river aquifer interaction based on the usual head-dependent flow relationship, so we can have a gaining river and a losing river where the water table is below the base of the river. Now, all these are being tested on these validation examples at the moment, and the next step is to combine this work with our conceptual understanding, our knowledge of parameter distributions on the African continent, and then build the first test case. As I've already said, in terms of the British mainland groundwater system approach, it's very much a case of we try things on groundwater systems we know and love, and then build them up to a greater level of understanding, greater scale. And it's the case with the global model. We're planning to start on Africa next, and then build up to the global model in subsequent years. So that's all I want to say at the moment. There's clearly a lot more I could cover, and given I've got 10 minutes, I'm going to have to be quiet there to allow other colleagues a chance to speak. But thanks very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions on with Eleanor in the next section. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So we've got 5 minutes of questions for Andrew and Eleanor. And I'm going to start with the first question to Eleanor. In order to address concerns over urban flooding, there is a move to implement many more sustainable drainage systems in urban areas, which seek to capture, retain and slowly release water on and near the surface. What implications might this have on urban evaporation and urban hydrology?
Oh, fantastic question. I think that I'm guessing that if you're trying to get the water more quickly, with urban drainage, you need to get the water away from the surfaces more quickly. you know, because it's a hazard. And the impact on evaporation, I mean, so the impact on hydrology is obviously, I think it's been nicely designed for hydrology to slow down the flood wave and so on. I think that's a really important thing to do. The impact on evaporation it will matter, but only during the flood event, I'm guessing. I think probably for urban evaporation, an important aspect that might not be captured very well in the model, I have to say, might be a lot of vegetation within a city. There's lots of trees, gardens and stuff, and I wonder actually whether we have we've got enough, we've taken enough account of urban vegetation, and I think there was a whole programme to take measurements of evaporation over suburban areas, and I think we might need to look at that actually, because they look like awfully strong hotspots, and I think we need to probably check that out. But so if it's drainage that's going into something that might re-evaporate, like those drainage that goes in then into parks and supplies water to trees and stuff, that will affect the evaporation, and I think we need to capture that in the model. So thanks for the question. Not sure I answered it very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. That's a great answer. And I'd like to ask another question to you, Eleanor, from one of our listeners. The other moisture flux to the atmosphere from the land is from transpiration. Could you give a picture of the relative magnitude of transpiration compared to evaporation?
That's a very good question as well. It's, you know, it's a very hotly debated topic, but it's over 50%. It's about 60 or 70%. Now, it might depend on where you are. It's hotly debated because some people recently suggested it was as high as 90%. But I think we're questioning their methods. So we think it's probably of the order of 60 or 70%. The rest of it is then straight just from the evaporation and the wet bodies, the lakes and so on. But a really important part, probably it can be up to 30% in some regions, is the interception. So the amount of water that's captured on particularly on trees and re-evaporated is a significant part of the evaporation budget. So transpiration is important, about 3/4. Yeah.
Thank you. Question for Andrew. The UK part of your talk appears to focus on the major aquifers. What about the superficial aquifers, which often play important roles in surface hydrological systems, which also often poorly characterised and which are often poorly characterised and monitored? Sorry for that.
No, that's great. Thank you for that question. That's really interesting, because I mentioned something about meta modelling earlier in my talk and said I couldn't go into any detail. So yes, we're very, you know, would be very remiss as the Geological Survey not including quaternary deposits or quaternary processes into any of our work. And I agree completely with the questioner that basically, if you look at, I always think it's sort of bagatelle. If you look at how water might move from the bottom of the soil zone down to its eventual eventually into the water table, then there's a lot that can happen between that, and they are often related to superficial deposits or quaternary deposits. And at the moment, we've actually got a bit of work from colleagues that are coming up with conceptual understanding of quaternary processes around Britain, and we're going to translate that into a subset of conceptual models, which we can then use that to understand and simulate how potential recharge, that's what water coming from soil drainage, actually then becomes actual recharge. So short answer is no, we haven't ignored that. I agree it's completely challenging and very important, and it's something we are working on. So again, it's watch this space really. But yeah, I'd obviously, you know, contact us and I can provide more details about how we're planning on undertaking that.
Thank you. Another question for Eleanor. Could you say a bit more about how you include interception in the PETI calculation?
Oh yeah, so actually we captured that because that's how the MOREX, when MOREX put out their PE, they include interception. So basically, we allow the rain, whenever it rains, we take that surface resistance value down to 0 and calculate how long that would. So we alter, we paddle between RS of 60 seconds per metre to RS of 0 while we consider the surface to be wet, which is the method that the MOREX use. And the MOREX PE is the one that's used a lot by the hydrological community. So we knew we needed to deliver a product that was equivalent. So that's the PETI. It's not the standard FAO definition of PE, but it's the one that hydrologists have been using, and the Environment Agency in particular.
And now we're going to move to Elizabeth Cooper.
Hi everybody, I'm just going to show my screen. So I am going to talk a bit about some work we've done using data assimilation to improve JULES soil moisture outputs, but also tell you a bit about how we think we can start to use data assimilation to try to unravel some information about the soil hydraulics physics processes and how they're represented in JULES. So this is work that I've done with colleagues from UKCEH, but also with Ewan Pinnington, who works for NCEO, based at the University of Reading. So data assimilation is important in HydroJULES in a number of ways. And just as a very kind of brief introduction, data assimilation is a way of combining information from process-based physical models with observations of the same system, taking into account the relative uncertainties in each of them. We do this in order usually to improve the outputs from our models, but we can also use it to find out things that we want to know, depending on how we do that data assimilation. So I'm going to tell you about some work I've been doing. I'm going to tell you about the observations we've used of soil moisture. I'm going to tell you about the model we've used to get equivalent soil moisture to go into the data assimilation framework. I'm going to tell you briefly about some experiments we've run using Lavendar, which is a data assimilation framework written by Ewan Pinnington. And then I'm going to tell you about how this is helping us to start to unravel some information about a process in JULES called infiltration excess runoff, and how this has led to more interesting questions. So the observations come from our Cosmos UK network, which is a UKCEH run network of about 50 sites throughout the UK. Each one has a cosmic ray neutron sensor, which measures soil moisture over a footprint of about a 200-metre radius. And each one of these sites, we also have instruments to measure meteorological variables, and in particular, all of the variables that we need to run JULES, which is, I'm sure you all know, the Joint UK Land Environment Simulator. So that means we've got observations in particular places, and we can also run our model to get equivalent model outputs. And this is just a schematic to show how JULES gives us soil moisture predictions. So in the place that you're interested, you need to know something about the soil texture. And in this case, you need to just know the relative fractions of sand, silt and clay. You then plug these into a system of equations called pedotransfer functions, which have constants in them. And these constants should be constant in time and space. And out of there, you get 8 soil physics parameters, which have a kind of physical meaning, and it kind of describe how the different the soil hydraulics processes happen in JULES. Sorry, I've got an IT issue there. Okay, sorry about that. So we plug these soil physics parameters into JULES along with the measured meteorological drivers from the Cosmos UK network, and out pop the soil moisture predictions. And what we've then done is we've taken these soil moisture predictions, plugged them into the data assimilation framework with the equivalent observations, and we've optimized these constants here, kappa 1 to kappa 12, in our pedotransfer functions. So we can then redo this bit of the process. We can get some new soil physics parameters, rerun JULES, and then we hope that our new soil physics, our new JULES outputs of soil moisture look closer to the observations than the original ones, and that is exactly what we find. So this plot here is just soil moisture time series. The pink dots are our Cosmos observations at a particular site. The yellow line is our original run of JULES with the kind of default values for these kappa 1 to kappa 12 values. And then the blue line is what we get when we've done our optimization. So we've definitely improved our soil moisture outputs. And that was the same at all of the sites that we looked at, which is really nice. So the pedotransfer functions that we've used in this work look like this, and the exact form of them isn't really important, but I just wanted to show you that these are the constants that we've optimized, and you can see that they're controlling the kind of dependence on the soil texture, and then there's some other kind of first order controls on these parameters as well. Each one of these has a physical meaning, and we found that in order to get the better fit to the observations that we saw, these were the three that were really changing. So we were changing how wet the soil could get when it was saturated, we were changing how tightly the water was held within the soil matrix, and we were also changing how fast the water can move in the soil. And in particular, this parameter was getting a lot smaller, so we were really slowing down the speed of the water in the soil, which was all well and good, except it turned out that this parameter also has another job within the JULES setup. So it does, so our, in order to get a really nice fit to the observations, we were slowing down the movement of the water in the soil, but we also are changing the threshold for a process called infiltration excess runoff. And this is a process which is really important in urban areas, as Eleanor was talking about before. So this is just a schematic to show what infiltration excess runoff looks like. We get rain, and anything that comes through the vegetation is called throughfall. This is the soil surface here. Usually most of the water, at least in kind of agricultural areas, can infiltrate. But if this is very intense, or if we've got a kind of non-permeable surface, we also get some runoff, and this is the process that we were finding we were also changing. So our smaller KSAT that we were finding for our through our data assimilation was slowing down the water through the soil to give us better fit to soil moisture, but we're also getting less infiltration because we were triggering more runoff more often. So in order to try to kind of correct this, we've added an extra parameter into JULES. So we've separated out basically the two jobs of KSAT. So now KS really only controls how fast the water can move, and we've added an extra input parameter to JULES, which controls when runoff starts. And then we reran our experiments with optimizing now kappa 1 to kappa 15 in these equations. And we found that we still got a really nice fit to our soil moisture observations. So each one of these are two different sites now, soil moisture time series, and in each case, the yellow solid and the yellow dotted lines are our original JULES runs, and the blue solid lines and the blue dotted lines are after data assimilation. And the dotted line is where we've separated out those two jobs of the KSAT parameter. On this site in particular, they're so similar, you can't really see any difference. Here you can just about see a difference, that we can see that our new approach is doing slightly worse relative to the observations here, slightly better here, but overall we found that the fits were extremely similar and definitely much better than our original runs. And we also found that, as we expected, we're now getting less runoff at all of these sites as well. So this is just some plots to try to show that. So we've got runoff in millimeters per day here on our y-axis, and then just day since the beginning of 2017 on the x-axis. And you can see at this site, we're originally, with our original parameters, we're not triggering very much runoff at all. When we did our original optimization with KSAT having two jobs, we triggered quite a lot of runoff. And then by separating it out, we're getting something a bit more like we saw before. What this runoff should really look like, we don't actually know, and that's one of the really interesting things that we're looking at next. We hope to be able to try and use some river flow data to try to work out what this parameter actually should look like. Probably haven't really got time to talk about these, but just to show that the kappa 1 to kappa 12 or kappa 1 to kappa 15 values did change between the two different approaches. And our soil physics parameter values also changed slightly at each site as well. Everything was generally moving in the same sort of direction, whether we had one KSAT or kind of two KSAT parameters. And in fact, the physics parameters, when we have separated out those two jobs of KSAT, actually look slightly more well behaved in some ways, which is nice. So just to summarize, we've found that we can improve our soil moisture outputs by using data assimilation. We've uncovered a a possible way of separating out these two different jobs for our KSAP parameter by looking at the outputs from a data assimilation. And the new questions are, what should this max inf parameter really look like? And we hope to be able to answer that by looking at some river flow data. And there's also this question about whether it should depend on kind of rain intensity through the rain input time step. We want to know, if we use our new physics parameters, what does that do to a weather or climate forecast if we plug it into a bigger model? And the overarching question for my research is really, what does all of this mean for process representation? So how can we best use our model outputs and any observations really that we have available to us through data assimilation to figure out what our JULES process representation is doing well, and also what needs improving. Okay, that's all I've got, thanks.
Thank you, Liz. And we'll pass you on now to Thibaut Allouine. Please, just a reminder, if you have questions for Liz and Thibaut at the end of Thibaut's presentation, please put them into the question box.
So yeah, I'm Thibaut Allouine. I work at NCAS, and for Hydro-JULES, I work on the development of the modeling framework. And today I'm going to go through a brief overview of the conceptual and technical aspects of this framework. So first, where are we coming from and why are we working on this new modeling framework? So it comes from a few limitations in the modeling of hydrological processes in land system models. So historically, they were developed as a lower boundary condition to atmospheric models. And that comes with a few implications in terms of the hydrology. So they inherit the resolution of the atmospheric grid when the two models are coupled, because it makes for easy exchange of information. So the land heterogeneity and the hydrological structures within this atmospheric grid are usually accommodated for by using a large variety of subgrid approaches, such as mosaic schemes or tiling schemes, but they're only implicit, spatially implicit. They also inherited a column-based approach, so a vertical exchange of information between the land grid cell and the above atmospheric grid cell. Which means that the grid cells are not communicating laterally, so there is an absence of the lateral flows that would happen in the hydrological cycle. And also the two-way interaction between the land and the ocean is often overlooked, so there is an absence of ocean feedbacks such as tides and storm surges. So Hydro-JULES, in terms of the contributions that we intend to make to overcome these limitations, so we will be providing a new modeling framework for this terrestrial water cycle. So in a nutshell, it will be a modular representation of the water cycle. So you'll have interchangeable modules that we refer to as components. So you should hear interchangeable processes or science for these different components, and also possible two-way communication with external models, such as climate and ocean models. And we'll also support and maintain a repository of components, including obviously a modular version of JULES, hence the name of the project, but also new groundwater models. So Andrew presented them earlier, or gave you an overview, and also some inundation models such as Camouflage will be provided. So first, looking at it conceptually, so this modular representation of the terrestrial water cycle. So that's the diagram on the left-hand side. So the water cycle will be subdivided into three main components, which are surface layer, the subsurface, and the open water. So below the headings, you have the different water pools that will fall within these different components. And the idea behind dividing this land system into different components is that the resolutions of these components can be adapted to the equations they are aiming to solve. So spatially speaking, they can be adapted to the dominant structures of heterogeneity that you have. And temporally speaking, you can adapt them to the timescale and the dynamics of the dominant processes at play for this in this component. Each component will come with its own numerical framework, so its own solver for the energy, water, and biochemical cycles. And we hope that each scientific community and the respective models and expertise will map into one or more of these components, and not one and a half, basically. That's the hope. So then they can contribute to the repository that we're going to maintain. So I mentioned that we will support different resolutions for these components. So looking at space first, so each component can feature its own spatial discretization. Then we'll come up with the concept, well, an existing concept of the supermesh, which is determined from the resolution of all of the other components. So it's the pink, so the spatial supermesh on the diagram in the middle. And that's to preserve the continuity equations of the transfers between the components. And each grid cells or polygons can communicate with their neighbors. So lateral flow is allowed. So you have here on this diagram in the middle, so you could have using a regular grid but different lat long resolutions. So that's what the supermesh would look like. And then maybe a more complicated example where for the subsurface, you may be looking at using a river subbasin polygons and the triangular river mesh for the open water. So that's in the future, the flexibility that we want to bring. And in terms of time, so they can all have their own time stepping scheme. The only constraint we have is that all components must be a multiple integer of the fastest running component. So now looking at the interface between those components, so we're going for a fixed interface of transfers, so information between those components. So looking first at the water cycle, so that's a draft of the exchanges, the transfers that you would have between those components. What is important to say here is that they are all potentially two-way coupled, and that each component has to comply with this fixed interface. So the information it produces and the information that it needs to incorporate has to comply with that, basically. The transfers can be fluxes, can be ratios, such as soil water stress. They can be states, possibly like the water level in the river network, for example. And the interface may in the future feature a set of transform functions to allow for the conversion from maybe component-specific transfers into the set transfers that the interface has to kind of provide more flexibility in the users bringing their own components into the framework. Last thing on the conceptually, so each component will have two levels of interaction. So application programming interface API. So it's based on this nested API that the Met Office came up with for Jules and its interaction with Elfric. So there is this managed API and this naked API, and basically the difference between the two is how memory is handled for the model states, because typically a climate model such as the unified model will want to handle the memory itself for the surface layer, and we want to be able to support that as well, so that our framework can communicate with these models and providing this flexibility. Now, technically speaking, what are we actually implementing? So we're currently working on a Python package, which is a first implementation of the framework blueprint. So it's just a proof of concept. So I won't go over the details of the different objects that we have in the implementation. What is important to look at is that so the three components together form the model, and that's the model itself that provides some functionality for the components to actually run. So in particular, the time stepping happens within the clock concept, and the potential, well, the remapping between the components and the exchange of information go through the interface. So that's all provided by the framework, and only the science has to be provided by the users or being picked up from the repository that we'll have. If you want to contribute to the repository, you have to comply with two important things. As I said earlier, the component has to comply with the fixed interface, so the information in, the information out, and it has to be implemented following an initialize, run, finalize paradigm. So initialize being setting the model states to their initial condition values. Run is actually doing proper science and solving the equations. And finalize is putting the component in a situation where you are able to restart from its endpoint. It's going to be implemented, so it actually can run it in parallel using the MPI protocol. And last slide before the summary. So we're going to support components, well, as long as they follow the initialize and finalize paradigm that are written in Python, obviously, but also in Fortran and in C/C++. So looking at a few examples, Jules will be the first case we'll have. So it's all written in Fortran. So each component will be called from Python from Fortran into Python. But you could also look at another example where you would want to benefit from the land surface processes that are in Jules. So it will be in Fortran, coupling that with a rainfall runoff model that may be written in C, and a hydraulic model that may be a pure Python script. So that will be possible. To summarize, so Hydro-JULES aim to provide a new blueprint, subdividing the terrestrial water cycle into components so that the spatial and temporal scales of its components can be adapted to the equations that they are aiming to solve. We are working on the first implementation of this blueprint as a Python package with the possibility of Fortran and C extensions. There will be a complete incorporation of the Jules model as a modular version of it. The framework will be able to communicate in a two-way fashion with atmospheric and ocean models. And we hope that this framework is going to support and promote the development and the comparison of modeling components. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Thibaut. And we just move on now to questions for Liz and Thibaut. And then after that, we will go back to Simon for a final summary of our presentations today. The first question for Liz is, how do you compare the model output to observed data? I think the resolution of model output and observed data resolution is different.
We're actually running at a point at the moment, so we're looking at, we're kind of comparing kind of field scale Cosmos UK observations, and we're running the model at a point and assuming that it covers that. But it's an interesting question actually, because when we're kind of recalibrating these pedal transfer functions, we think that part of the reason that we're getting different answers is because we are now using large scale observations. So part of the difference might be that we're now trying to represent these processes at larger scales at which they're likely to happen, rather than at kind of point scales, which is how they've been calibrated before. I hope that answers that.
Okay, thank you. And then I'd like to go to another question, which is from Freya Jones. Earlier in the talk, it was mentioned that there were 8 types of soil physics parameters. Could you give some examples of these, please?
So there's 8 soil physics parameters which go into Jules, and so they control things like the one I talked about, how fast the water can move through the soil. They control so there's matrix suction, which controls kind of how tightly the soil holds onto the water. There's the kind of maximum level of water you can have in the soil when it's saturated, and then there's a couple of parameters which control the kind of the thermal properties of the soil, so the conductivity and the something else for soil, for the thermal properties. And then there's a couple of parameters which kind of look after vegetation response to the soil as well. So describe at what point the vegetation will start to get stressed and will wilt. So those are the kind of physical processes that Jules, or the parameters that Jules needs to describe the physical processes with.
Thank you. And another question for you before we move on to some questions for Thibaut. To what extent are the new parameters of the pedo-transfer function believable, as opposed to just fitted numbers that would be unsuitable for other purposes?
Yeah, that's a really important question, actually. And one of the things we've been really careful is that the parameters do look to be within the kind of physical range that they should have. And it is possible within the data assimilation framework we've used to put some constraints on the parameter values, but we didn't do that. We wanted to see what would happen if we don't kind of force it into the natural range for those parameters, and we actually found that they do fit into the kind of accepted range of values. So yeah, so that was one of the things that made us think our work was hopefully going in the right direction. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Liz. And over to Thibaut. Several modular modelling frameworks for land surface and hydrological modelling already exist, for example, SUMA or Raven. They were already implemented and are operational. What can Hydro-JULES learn from them?
Certainly a lot. We've had Martin Clark presenting Suma to us, and then I'm aware of Raven as well. It's a slightly different approach that we are taking, talking about Suma maybe, for example, where we kind of want to benefit from the existing models that are out there and try to couple them together as long as they comply with this fixed interface. So there is definitely, like, we're looking into these other frameworks as well and trying to see what we can learn from them. I know that, for example, in terms of the spatial configurations, looking into hydrological response units and things like that, there will definitely be things that we can learn from in these frameworks. So yeah, that's right, that there is already some frameworks out there, and we don't want to duplicate the work, that's for sure.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to hand us back now to Simon to end this webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Great, thank you very much indeed to everybody who's presented, and also to everybody who has asked questions in the chat. We've had close to 100 people attending the webinar, which is fantastic to see so many people engage with the program like that, and to have such a range of questions as well is really good. I've just got a couple of questions that I was going to pick up from the chat which have come through in my closing remarks. One is a question about, is the JULES model available for people to use? And the answer emphatically to that is yes. I'm sure if Eleanor Blythe was answering, she would be encouraging people as well to visit the JULES and the Hydro-JULES web pages in order to work out how you can get access to the JULES model. It's freely available, open source, and collaboration is very welcome. It's a very open community and one which is very welcoming. The only thing it remains for me to do is to thank everybody for joining. We are, of course, sad that we couldn't hold this meeting in person, but we hope to do so next year, and look forward to welcoming you there. So thanks very much to everybody for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.